Today, I'm delighted to welcome Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat to our program. He served as ambassador to the European Union and in senior positions in the Department of State, Treasury, and Commerce. For many years, he's been the special negotiator for the Jewish Claims Conference, and in a variety of government positions, he has been a major figure in negotiating Holocaust restitution with a variety of countries. He's also served as chair of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council. Now, he's also written a major book, The Art of Diplomacy, which recounts important American diplomatic efforts over the last 50 years, based in part on 130 interviews he's done with presidents, ambassadors, and other senior officials who were involved in a variety of extremely important and critical and delicate negotiations. Ambassador, delighted that you're joining us today, and welcome.
President Herbst, thank you very much. And I'm a great supporter and fan of American Jewish University as well. So it's a privilege to be with you.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. Maybe you could tell us, as a start, why did you write this book? And after you've written it and done these interviews, what's your conclusion about the important set of skills that are necessary for a diplomat?
Well, thank you for both of those questions. I wrote the book for three reasons. The first is that we live in turbulent times with seemingly insoluble problems. And I wanted to show how over the last 50 years, American diplomats were able to solve equally daunting problems and can do so again in the future. Second, we live in the midst of hot wars going on as we speak in Gaza, in Ukraine, potential conflict over Taiwan with China. During our own lifetimes, we've had multiple wars in which the U.S. has been involved: in Vietnam, the two Balkan wars in Bosnia and Kosovo during the Clinton administration, in which I was involved, the two Iraq wars under President Bush 1 and 2, the Afghan war after 9/11, and then the war in Libya, which President Obama called his worst mistake. And I wanted, therefore, to take these and look at when, whether, and how military force can be applied to be a constructive complement to diplomacy, and when they should not be used. And third, we are living, unfortunately, I think, in an era of potential isolationism, not dissimilar to what we had between the First and Second World Wars, where a whole group of Americans and people in Congress, as we saw over the Ukraine funding fight, seemed to want to retreat behind our ocean. And I wanted to demonstrate how active U.S. engagement was so important to creating a better world, to reaching agreements, and that if we do retreat into isolationism and nationalism, we will leave a huge vacuum into which the Russias and Chinas and Irans and other countries that have very different interests and values will fill, at the great disadvantage of ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren. Now, you asked the common skills. First of all, diplomacy is not a game of poker. It's not a winner-take-all situation, because you're negotiating with other countries. And they have to make it so that they can bring it back to their constituencies. It has to be a win-win situation. And that requires a common set of skills that run through all of the 12 chapters and all the 12 major agreements that I mentioned. And they are as follows. First, a fierce determination to grab history when it changes and reach an agreement. Example, George H.W. Bush, when the Berlin Wall fell, which no one anticipated, realized this was a historic opportunity not only to reunite West and East Germany, but to do so within NATO. And that was an enormous lift, given the fact that all of the occupying forces in Germany opposed it. Margaret Thatcher, who was then the UK prime minister said, I love Germany so much, I want two of them. A second skill, which may seem unusual, is courage. Not the courage of the battlefield, but the courage to break from established patterns, to break from your own political basis. This was most obvious in my book in the Good Friday Agreement, which settled the terrible civil war between the Unionists and the Nationalists, the Protestants and the Catholics. And in what the British, in great understatement, called the Troubles, had killed 3,500 people and wounded tens of thousands of others. And it took great courage for the leaders of the respective parties to say enough is enough, even though our constituents may want to continue this fight, we've got to find a solution. Third is high intelligence combined with wisdom and judgment about people. And Henry Kissinger and Zhou Enlai China certainly showed that during the opening to China. Fourth is what the trade representative for President Trump, Bob Lighthizer, called preparation, preparation, and preparation. Knowing the issues that you're negotiating so well, both from your side and the others, that you can reach an agreement, you know where the areas of compromise are. Next, again, is something that may seem unusual. It's the ability and capacity to listen to what the other side is saying. How are they saying it? Is it just rote talking points, or is this really their bottom line? And then once you listen, to put yourself in their shoes, look at it from their standpoint. When I was Deputy Treasury Secretary in the Clinton administration, my secretary, my boss, Larry Summers, in his interview with me, called this, interestingly, unsympathetic empathy for the other side. Next is developing a personal relationship with the person you're negotiating with, as difficult as that might be. Example, in the German reunification negotiations, there was tremendous resistance, particularly from the Soviet Union, which had lost 20 million people in World War II. James Baker, who wrote a preface to the book, and Henry Kissinger the Ford, developed a personal relationship with the Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze by taking him to his retreat at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where they developed a very personal relationship, talked about the importance of solving this German issue for their children and grandchildren. And that personal relationship is critical. I developed it with my German interlocutor when I was doing the German slave labor negotiation. Next is creativity. I call the book The Art of Diplomacy, and there is an art to it. Creativity is essential because, President Herbst, there's always going to be a time in a major negotiation where you reach a seeming impasse, and you have to find a way around it. Example, in the Good Friday Agreement, the negotiations began while the militias were still killing each other. And a lot of the parties said, this is crazy. How can we negotiate while they're still fighting each other? And so they said, disarm the militias. That's the condition to fight. Well, they refused to. There was so much distrust. So in a creative effort, Senator Mitchell, George Mitchell, developed what he called the Mitchell principles, which were, okay, you can keep your arm, but you have to sign an agreement that you're going to settle this by peaceful means, and that enabled them to get around that impasse. Next, with the Olympics now over and Los Angeles being the next host in 2028, I'll use an analogy to that, and that is these negotiations are marathon with a sprint at the end. They don't last a day, a week, a month. They often last years, and they always seem to end at 3 o'clock in the morning with a sprint. So having the stamina to think clearly, to keep a cool head is really critically important. The whole concept of shuttle diplomacy started with Henry Kissinger, who again wrote the foreword to the book, when for 2 weeks with almost no sleep after the 73 Yom Kippur War, he shuttled between Syria and Israel and Egypt. Jimmy Carter got maybe 2 hours sleep at Camp David over 13 days. And when I was doing the Kyoto climate change negotiations, I averaged maybe 3 hours of sleep. So stamina is really critically important. Next, to choose another sports analogy, don't swing for home runs or you'll strike out. Go for singles, go for doubles, go for incremental agreements that you can build on. Example, at Camp David, the Palestinians were not represented. It was a bilateral agreement between Egypt and Israel. Had we tried to get the Palestinians, and we did try, had they been there, it might have been too much and overloaded the circuits. Another example of not swinging for the fences is the Good Friday Agreement, where the two key issues were what's the future status of Northern Ireland, a 100-year debate, and what do you do with the arms of the militias? Well, neither one was resolved at the Good Friday Agreement. For example, it called for a referendum for the final status, which has never been held because the parties are too concerned with what the outcome will be. Next is something that was used in the Middle East process by my friend Yossi Beilin, and that is back channels. And this occurs when the two parties so distrust each other, President Herbst, that they won't get in the same room. So the way that the famous Oslo Accords in 1993, in which Israel recognized the PLO and the PLO recognized Israel, occurred because of back channel negotiations that the Israeli government was not directly involved with. And remarkably, Prime Minister Rabin literally didn't know they were occurring until Yossi and his Palestinian colleagues brought the results to him. We've seen that back channel happen right now with the hostage deal with Gaza, which at least worked for the first 100, between Qatar and Egypt and the US acting as back channels between Hamas and Israel. Next is what I would call leverage. We all are used to leverage. We do that with our spouses, our partners, our children, our grandchildren, in my case, unsuccessfully. And the use of leverage by negotiators is really critical. There are two types of leverage, positive and negative. Positive leverage comes from being a superpower, where you can offer things like market access for products to grease the wheel. Or in the case of the famous Abraham Accords with President Trump involving the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel, at the end of the day, what the UAE needed to finalize the agreement with Israel is F-35 fighter jets from us. That's a positive leverage. Now, the negative leverages are first economic sanctions, and we have them right now against Russia because of Ukraine. We have them on Iran. We have them against Maduro in Venezuela. We have them to some extent against China. I was an expert in the whole issue of sanctions. During the Clinton administration, I was sort of called a sanctions meister. But now in 2024, President Herbst, economic sanctions are not as effective as they used to be. We don't have a monopoly on products. The Russians, for example, have found ways to create fake companies and transship products to third countries and then fourth countries and then finally off to them. So economic sanctions are declining utility. The threat of force is another negative leverage. For example, right now, what happened just now is after Israel assassinated Haniyeh, the international leader of Hamas in Tehran, there was a genuine fear that there would be a massive retaliation by Iran and its proxies. So what did President Biden do? He used the threat of force. That is, he took an additional aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean loaded with F-16 fighter jets. He announced, which we almost never do, that a submarine was going. And that threat of force has, at least to this time, it's been almost a month now, avoided this. Now, the last, and this I'll close with, is actual use of force. This is the ultimate leverage. And here there have to be several things to fall into place to make it successful. Number one, it should be the last option you use after you've exhausted every other one, after you've tried diplomacy, after you've tried economic sanctions, after you've tried the threat of force, because I've seen it up close now serving presidents. I've worked in 6 administrations. The use of military force is a huge issue for presidents. It involves the potential loss of life of our men and women. Second, it has to be in our supreme national interest. I mean, right now, as we speak, there's a terrible genocide going on in Sudan with the Arabs killing the Black Sudanese, but it's not sufficiently in our interest for us to intervene. Third, and this was crucial for Gaza, and unfortunately something that Israel still to this day hasn't done. And I got this actually from Steve Hadley, the National Security Advisor to George W. Bush, and from Condoleezza Rice, as Secretary of State. And that is, they felt that the biggest mistake that they made, and that we often make when we use military force, is before the first bullet is fired, before the first bomb is dropped, before the first plane is launched, you should know what the political objective is, and it should be a reasonably achievable political objective. And what they were saying with respect to Iraq is, yes, they deposed Saddam Hussein very quickly, but they didn't have in place a clear idea politically of what followed, and that's been true even to this day in Gaza. Next, if you're going to intervene, understand the culture, the internal dynamics, the history of the country. General Petraeus said in his interview to me, you need to have a nuanced understanding of the country before you invade, and we didn't in Afghanistan and in Iraq. We really didn't understand those countries. We thought when we deposed the Sunni Arab leader Saddam in a majority Sunni country, we didn't realize the implications. Next, recognize the barriers to military intervention. You know, former heavyweight champion Mike Tyson said, everyone has a great plan until they get in the ring and they're hit in the mouth. Now, in our Kosovo effort, we used 77 days of bombing, President Herbst, by NATO against the Serbs to bring them to the negotiating table. But during one of those bombing episodes, we mistakenly bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999. To this day, they think it was done on purpose. So there are always going to be errors and mistakes. Next is, if you're going to use force, this is what Colin Powell said in his interview with me, unfortunately, shortly before he passed away, use decisive force. George H.W. Bush did so with Powell's leadership in the first Gulf War, trying to get Saddam out of Kuwait. The UN resolution they got, a NATO resolution they got, 38 country coalition they got together, 500,000 troops. Contrast that with his son 12 years later, who forgot that crucial lesson. His own Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, said, we're going to get involved with a quote unquote light footprint. And so he divided our forces between Afghanistan and Iraq, and they weren't sufficient. Last, and this is something that applies, unfortunately, also directly to Israel, is the essential need for good intelligence. So we all know that when we invaded Iraq in the second war with Iraq under George W. Bush, Bush II, that the premise was to get his weapons of mass destruction, and none were found. Well, one of the key findings in my book, and I think the biggest surprise, was that Saddam did have weapons of mass destruction, but President Herbst, he had destroyed them in compliance with UN resolutions, but didn't want to admit it for fear it would embolden his domestic opponents and get Iran to invade. I was subject to one of the worst intelligence failures in the Carter administration, in the Carter White House, and that is 6 weeks before the Shah was forcibly required to leave his country. This was our guy in the region under 6 presidents. 6 weeks before, the CIA said to President Carter and to us that Iran is in neither a revolutionary nor even a pre-revolutionary stage. They didn't even know he had a curable cancer, which is remarkable. And the failure of intelligence in Gaza has been a terrible mistake. So in the Jewish People's Policy Institute, which Dennis Ross and I chair in Jerusalem, we had briefings from several Israeli generals, and they said that the failure of intelligence was staggering, not just the failure to anticipate the battle, the actual October 7th war, because they actually had a piece of paper that showed that, which they disregarded. It was the failure to realize that Hamas had morphed from a terrorist group into a full-blown 40,000 person terrorist army, well-armed, well-trained, embedded in tunnels. Now, yes, they said, we knew there were tunnels. We didn't know there were 350 miles of tunnels. I've been to Gaza. I'll tell you about that hopefully in the question period, because it was in another day in another era. But I've been to Gaza. I know how small it is. 350 miles of tunnels, some as deep as a 25-story building. They didn't realize that. And that failure of intelligence has been fatal to Israelis and has caused all the problems we have now in Gaza. So the conclusion of all of this is diplomacy can be and must be used to solve our problems. It can be effective, but it also requires the American people and the U.S. government to be strong economically, politically, militarily, and something we're missing now is avoiding the kind of polarization. It's very hard for an American diplomat to negotiate with another country if they know that there's such division on the issue at home.
Well, Ambassador, thank you so much for that wonderful summary of a complicated book, although, of course, we still hope that readers will read the book. I'll be asking the ambassador some more questions, and then we welcome questions from you, the audience. Please submit them now via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Ambassador, would you say there's a distinctive American style of diplomacy?
I think that there is. Each of the people I interviewed had their own style, but I think, for example, Kissinger said that his style was at the very beginning to announce what the goal of the negotiation was. What was each party trying to achieve? But the real, I think, common thread that is distinctive for American diplomacy is, and it's built into our DNA, it is to do everything possible to actually reach an agreement, to try to do so understanding the dynamics of the other side, not simply saying, this is what America wants, this is what we're determined to get, and follow us or forget it. Yes, we have our own needs, for sure, but we do more than almost any other country to try to put ourselves in the other side's shoes. In addition, this is why I feel so intensely about our need to continue to engage and not involve ourselves in isolationism. And that is, there is no other country, no other organization, no other entity that inserts itself in as many crucial issues and is viewed by all the other parties as an essential party. No other country is accepted in that way. Now you say, well, it's a multipolar world. Yes. There are other power centers. Yes. But when it comes to everything from climate change to the Middle East peace process to the war in Ukraine, the U.S. is always engaged. And that is, I think, something absolutely crucial and very precious to keep.
Let me ask you about negotiating with two difficult actors, Putin and Hamas. First, Putin. the Russian invasion of Ukraine more or less universally condemned, although there has been a significant criticism of American NATO negotiations with Putin that we blew it basically by expanding NATO, by making too many promises to Ukraine. What's your assessment of our diplomatic stance towards Putin, especially with regard to Ukraine? And do you think he could have been deterred with a different set of postures?
Putin understands only one thing, and that's power. And that's why it's so important to arm Ukraine and give it the capacity to get as much of its territory back. Now, let me go through this real quickly. Henry Kissinger said, and this pertains directly to your question, that no country can obtain at the negotiating table what it doesn't achieve on the battlefield. That's again why we need to make sure Ukraine gets as much aid as possible. I believe, given Putin's way of operating, that there will not be a formal peace treaty. There'll be something like the 1953 Korean armistice that ended the North Korea War. It's not a peace treaty between North and South Korea. To this day, there isn't. But for 70 years, there's been no conflict. And I think there'll be an armistice in which I hope we do not recognize whatever territory he's able to keep after the fighting ends in Ukraine. We don't end up in the sanctions arm, but we have an armistice in place, again, hopefully with as much territory gotten back as possible. It's also important that we not negotiate behind Zelensky's back. And we've done this before. We negotiated, Henry Kissinger got a Nobel Peace Prize for it. The negotiation which ended the Vietnam War was between he and North Korea, North Vietnam. The Saigon government was not involved. Likewise, more recently, the negotiation over Afghanistan in the Trump administration, and then continuing in the Biden administration, was between the US and the Taliban, not the government we spent 20 years defending. We can't do that to Zelensky. And last, and this is really crucial, there's an old proverb that says, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Well, we've been fooled by Putin twice. 1994 Budapest Memorandum. He gets in writing the Ukraine to agree to give up what was then the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in return for a commitment which he violated later, not to further invade Ukraine. Second time we were fooled. We ourselves, the United States, was party to something called the Minsk First and Second Agreements to end the fighting in the Donbass area and with the taking of Crimea. And we used the term in that agreement that the United States would, quote unquote, assure Ukraine against any further invasion. So fast forward from 2015 to February 21st, 2022, 2 days before the formal invasion of Kyiv. And Putin says publicly, President Herbst, Minsk is no more. So Zelensky's going to say, well, wait a minute. You want me to negotiate with this guy? How do I know that he's not going to just rest, rearm, and start all over again? We're not going to give him a NATO Article 5 guarantee because they're not going to be in NATO anytime soon. So my answer to that is, first, more bilateral defense agreements, as President Biden recently reached with Ukraine. I hope Germany does it, and France and the UK, to give them the arms in case there is another effort by Putin. Second is European Union membership. I was ambassador to you. There's no mutual defense agreement among EU countries, but it would be very difficult, I think, for Putin to invade an EU country. And third is we have NATO trainers in Ukraine now. Perhaps keeping them there as trainers would be a tripwire. But this is going to be a sensitive issue of what assurance Zelensky and the Ukrainian people will have that this won't simply be a rest on the way to yet another effort by Putin to capture more of Ukraine.
We could go on with Putin, but let me shift to Hamas. So Israel, since October 7th, has had two goals in Gaza. One, to defeat Hamas, second, to free the hostages. Those goals are not necessarily aligned. They could be contradictory. The U.S. has been negotiating with regard to at least the release of the hostages. What's your assessment of diplomacy with a non-state actor like Hamas that's involved in very much a hot war where not only Israelis, some Americans and others that are being held hostage, but the Gaza population to some extent is held hostage?
One of the problems in today's 21st century world is that non-state actors like Hamas, although technically it's the head of a government, but Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, non-state actors now have an enormous capacity to do harm. They're very well armed, oftentimes like a state in and of itself. So the question then is, how do you deal with that? Okay, first of all, Hamas has to be disabled as a governing and military force. No country can accept on its borders another entity or country which is determined to exterminate them. They're not fighting for a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution, which they will control. But military force alone is not sufficient. It's important, but not sufficient. You need to also have diplomacy. And my notion is that Israel's real security will come by looking at Gaza in a broader context. The real essence of the problem in Gaza with Hamas is Iran. Iran is the one that's funding them, arming them, as they're doing with the Houthis and Hezbollah. And Israel's real security, it seems to me, is to be embedded into a US-led moderate Sunni Arab coalition against Iran's axis of resistance with its proxy. And that's not out of reach at all, because Israel already has peace agreements with Egypt, with Jordan, with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco, and they will have it sooner rather than later with Saudi Arabia. But the condition that's being set by those Arab countries is some prospect of a solution. Doesn't have to be yesterday or tomorrow, of the Palestinian issue. And here we know that public opinion in Israel, for obvious reasons, has radically changed. Before October 7th, polls showed 60% plus with the two-state solution, 25% now. People are concerned it'll be a Hamas state. So you need, again, not to go for a home run, not to go immediately to a two-state solution, but something that relieves some of the pressure on the Palestinians, both in Gaza and the West Bank. Hopefully the army can do a better job of preventing some of the more radical settlers from taking Palestinian land and burning their olive trees and their cars and harassing them. So something that begins to build trust will be, I think, absolutely essential. But again, to think that there is a totally military solution to Gaza, as important as that military solution is also incorrect.
Ambassador, thank you. We're beginning to get a lot of questions from the audience, so let me go to them and try to get through as many as possible. One member of the audience writes, during the JCPOA, that's the Iran deal negotiations, President Obama asserted that all options are on the table, including military. Was that credible? And let me extend that to say, is American military deterrence credible against Iran today, or have we lost that?
So let me talk about this in two ways. The first is President Obama made a serious mistake with Syria, in which he said If they have chemical weapons or weapons of mass destruction, that would be a red line for us in terms of military action. Well, twice it was discovered that they did, and he didn't use military force. So when you threaten military force and you don't use it, it really undermines your credibility. Second, with respect to the JCPOA, that is the nuclear agreement, which the permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany reached with Iran in 2015. This makes another point, and that is the importance of continuity in agreements. So in 1980, Reagan beat us, Carter, decisively. He ran on a number of grounds, but one was that the SALT II nuclear agreement was bad, and yet he enforced it because during his whole time as president, because his predecessor did. Contrast that with what President Trump did by moving away from the JCPOA at a point where all its obligations are being kept by the Iranians. Now, there are certainly flaws in the JCPOA, but it boxed in their nuclear program. I can go into great detail about eliminating the centrifuges, getting their enriched uranium down to 2.5%, by moving away from what Obama had done and applying quote unquote maximum pressure. It's utterly failed. They're now at 60% enrichment of uranium. They've got new centrifuges. They've reactivated their plutonium plant at Iraq. So military force can be important, but the critical thing is to keep agreements when we reach it. Now, with respect to the statement that Iran can't be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, there's already been a joint effort, the so-called Stuxnet attack between the U.S. and Israel against their nuclear program. Israel has assassinated a number of their leaders, and I think that Iran does recognize that they want to become nuclear capable, but if they go across the line and actually go into actual production of nuclear weapons and then try to minimalize those and put them on rockets, that would invite military force. And I just hope that if we do commit that, it will actually follow through on it. I hope that the legitimate threat of force will prevent that.
We have a member of the audience who's read the book already and has a question about the book. And it's member of the audience writes, in your book, you discuss top-down and bottom-up approaches to climate negotiations. Going forward, will a bottom-up approach be sufficient to save the planet?
That's a great question. So let me explain what I meant by that. I negotiated in 1998 as the head of the U.S. delegation with 190 plus countries, the Kyoto protocols, which were a top-down process. That is, we took, at least the developed countries, took specific commitments for emissions reduction. And we for example, it was 6% compared to 1990 levels. But we didn't get the developing countries involved at all. And so the Senate would never ratify that. So a new approach was used, which were called bottom up. That is, get each country to make voluntary commitments and then have those commitments audited and followed and use the pressure of public opinion to try to help enforce them. Now, the question which your questioner correctly asked, is that enough? And I have to say to you, to be very honest, that's all we can get. We can't do a top-down treaty that would be binding on all the countries. And the Senate of the United States will never agree to a treaty in which the developed countries, particularly China and India, don't take legally binding commitments. So the best we can do are these informal commitments, which are published, which are audible, and we're finding that countries actually take them seriously. So China is now the biggest emitter in the world, but it's also the largest producer of solar panels, of wind turbines, of electric vehicles, of electric batteries. And I think that this bottom-up approach, which is the best we can do, can ultimately be successful together with technology, with learning how to have hydrogen, green hydrogen, to learn how we do carbon capture. And technology has made already a significant contribution.
Master, going back to the Middle East, perhaps inevitably, another member of the audience writes, do you see any hope for a two-state solution? And if you do you think there will be any new Palestinian leadership with whom Israel, U.S. can negotiate?
To be honest, I think in the near term, it's almost impossible to think, because public opinion in Israel has changed so much, and because we don't have a united, reasonable Palestinian leadership that's strong enough for an agreement. Now, I want to be really, really clear on this, because I wish we could show this to all the kids demonstrating on college campus. All right. First of all, I was in Gaza as Deputy Treasury Secretary in July of 2000. What I saw was beautiful. We passed through congressional legislation something called qualifying industrial zones. You could set up an industrial zone in Egypt and Jordan and the Palestinian territories because they had peace agreements. If you had as little as 10% Israeli content, you could ship back duty-free. What did I see in July 2000? 30 plants, not Israeli plants, American, Japanese, Singaporean, European, using some Israeli content, mostly Palestinian. I went into one of the plants. I saw the products being loaded on flatbed trucks, going right through the Eretz crossing in Gaza to the airport that we got the Corps of Engineers to build. One unarmed Israeli soldier was looking at that. One unarmed. Now, here's what I wish we could show to these kids on the campus. 1947, two-state solution by the UN, creating a Jewish and Arab state. The Arabs rejected. Camp David, the Palestinians refused to participate. Camp David II with Clinton, Arafat, and Prime Minister Barak. The Clinton parameters, 95% of the West Bank for Palestinian state, East Jerusalem was the capital, rejected by Arafat. Second Intifada strike. 2005, Aric Sharon, a very hardline prime minister, pulls every Israeli soldier out of Gaza. And the videos are here, President Herbst. I wish we could show them on every college campus. Kicking and screaming. The IDF got 7,000 Israeli settlers out of Gaza. There were no Israelis. They left all the infrastructure that I saw, greenhouses and this industrial park. Hamas wins the election in 2006, takes over in 2007, and sends rockets instead of roses. Now, until that attitude changes, it's very difficult to have a two-state solution. But I'm hopeful that if Hamas can be defeated, Palestinian Authority is weak, yes. It's corrupt, yes. But it signed Oslo. It is committed to a two-state solution. And I hope we can strengthen it sufficiently and give the Israeli public enough confidence, together with perhaps having multinational forces enforcing this so it's a demilitarized state, that the Israeli public, together with Saudi normalization, believes that we can ultimately go to a two-state solution. But that's going to take a good deal of time. It's not there today.
Master, we could talk about all these issues for a long period of time. We're running out of time, unfortunately. So let me ask you one last question. Some of the things you talk about, back channel negotiations, the personal relationships between negotiators are the need for sustained negotiations done in secret are obviously very important to negotiations, but they seem to have run into tension with democratic practice. So, and you've noted that, for more recent times, the U.S. has been polarized. People have gone back on negotiations. So what do you see as the relationship between the diplomacy that you've seen as successful and democratic practice?
Well, I don't think it is anti-democratic to have negotiations behind closed doors, because if you make them too open, the tendency to leak back to your own constituents is such that agreements could never be reached. The reason why President Carter chose Camp David for the Camp David Accords and kept the press out was to prevent both the Israeli and Egyptian sides from playing to their base by leaking what was happening. We would never have an agreement. So international agreements are not exercises in elections. Ultimately, the American people have to accept them. That's the ultimate democratic form of approval. And sometimes by treaty, in which you have the Senate voting, sometimes at the next election. But ultimately, the American people have to accept what's negotiated in their name, and that's where democracy comes into effect, but not in the midst of the negotiating room. What I do try to do in this book is put you into that room, let you see the pressures, the cross pressures that existed and how they were overcome.
Excellent. Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for sharing the lessons of your new book, The Art of Diplomacy.
Thank you for having me, and good luck to you and American Jewish University.
Thank you. And thank you to you, the audience, for joining us for another program from the Office of Open Learning. We hope that you'll go to our website, www.aju.edu often, to see the many exciting programs coming up. And of course, we hope that you'll continue to support our efforts to bring you the very best in Jewish programming. Ambassador, thank you so much. To the audience, thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you again soon.